Very daunting, and you can hear me, it's fine. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, Brian Dare. In my opinion, he's the author of arguably some of the most influential teacher training resources that have been published. I initially said this century, that sounds very grand, but since the 1990s. He's an advocate of functional linguistics, which is based on the Sydney School, following the work of Michael Halliday and Jim Martin. He advised the DFE, or the DES as it was then called, regarding the national strategy materials. The training courses he co-authored played a key role in the success, relative success, of the London Challenge, which ran from 2003 to 2011. Most recently, he trained advisors in Norfolk as tutors in the Language and Learning Across the Curriculum course. So he's no stranger to Norwich, and please welcome Brian Dare.
Hello, can you hear me? Yep. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for both the introduction and the invitation to present here today. It's a great privilege and honour to be here. I've got a lot in this presentation. I don't know how I'm going to go through it, but you should allow 1 minute per slide. That's the rule. We've got 110 slides, so I think I'm in deep trouble. Anyway, we'll see how we go. Okay. It's called Scaffolding Learning and Systemic Functional Linguistics. This was the kind of title that was given to me, so I'm going to address that in various parts. In part A, I'm going to have a look at a very, very brief look at the theoretical underpinnings of this model of language. So I'm going to give an overview of the functional model of language, and there's variations on this and how it's described, but some people use SFL, Systemic Functional Linguistics. Some call it Systemic Functional Grammar, and a lot of teachers call it funky grammar. I'm going to just give a nod to the principal architects of the Sydney School. Mark mentioned them, and the Sydney School came about really through our generous migration program. Because Halliday, of course, was originally English, moved to Australia, and Jim Martin, that Mark also mentioned, was Canadian. And then I'm going to talk about the work of the Adelaide School, and I'm kind of playing around with that a little bit. There's no such thing as the Adelaide School, really. But it's the work of principally John Polius and myself and others who took up the work of the Sydney School and kind of recontextualised it in terms of schooling, as much as any other people have done. So I'll say a little bit of work about a word about that. I'll just give a very brief introduction to to scaffolding through an explicit teaching and learning cycle, and this is the teaching and learning cycle that you will see on your handout. You've got two handouts. One is for the presentation here, and the other one's for the workshop. But on both, you've got a diagram of that. So we'll have a little bit of a look at that. But I want to make this clear from the outset. You're not going to understand, if this is the first time you've met the functional model of language and this teaching and learning cycle, you are not going to get anywhere near understanding its complexity. So that's not my intention. What I'll try and do, and this brings me to the second part, is to take up this issue of building a shared meta-language in the classroom. So a meta-language meaning a language for talking about language, right? So I'm going to do that by looking at classroom practice. I'm going to start off with a clause as the basic unit of meaning. And I'm going to look at how some teachers have taken that up. And Halliday always saw this as the fundamental unit of meaning. So that's going to be a starting point. I'm going to take up this issue of moving from spoken to written language. And this is probably familiar to a lot of you, more in the form of the Bix-Kaup kind of split. But in our terms, we look at moving from the more spoken end of the register continuum to the more written end. And then I'm going to look at a unit of work on light, and this is the clause in the whole damn thing. So we'll have a look at that. And this is all, I'm going to illustrate all of these through classroom practice. And then at the end, have a look at the efficacy of this approach. So we'll have a look at some evidence of success. Okay, so that's the scope. Okay, all right, let's go. Labeur. I put this up because when I first started learning French in year 8, when I was a 13-year-old, I was very excited to be learning a foreign language. This was something that quite exotic, and we were all looking forward to it. And I was in an all-boys school, and we had Brother Gerald as our French teacher. And the first lesson went something like this. Boys, open up your books at page 4 and say after me, labeur. All right? So we went, he'd go, labeur. We go, labeur. And he'd go, no, labeur. And we go, labeur. It went downhill from there in terms of learning a language. This text I'm about to show you is from a student who had a very different teacher, a teacher who I have great admiration for. And I use this particular text as a metaphor for, to some degree, to success with students who are disaffected with schooling. Jackson, as a 9-year-old, in this particular case, 10-year-old when he wrote this text, would not come to school. He wouldn't come to school. He's a school refuser. However, the good news was he would only come to school on one day of the week. And do you know what day that was? The day he had the Italian lesson. Right? Okay. So this is the text, one of the texts that Jackson produced. I could read it out for you and go through it, but he's saying something like, Nelle mie vacanze sono andati in America per 4 settimane, sono andati, a mistake, con la mia famiglia. Nella prima settimana ho visto la neve, and so he goes on. It's a recount, right? Okay? It's a very good text for a school refuser, isn't it? In another language, right? So I'm going to kind of use that as a metaphor for success in teaching about language. And I'm going to come back to it later and show you what his wonderful teacher, Rosa Valente, what she did to make him enjoy and love his Italian lesson so much. Let me take you back. I don't know if you can see this very well, but the heading says Parsing, and it was written on the 16th of July, 1952. And this is the text of a mother of a colleague, and she kept these books. And you can see that the parsing is going on here, the breaking up of the parts of the sentence into their various kind of grammatical categories. So working steadily during the day, the men progressed in digging the railway tunnel. And so she's analysed the various parts there, and then she's come to what's, if you've ever done this, was the subject and predicate kind of thing. Who did subject and predicate at school? Yeah. The next question is, what did you do with it? I did subject and predicate at school, and we didn't do anything with it. We just did it, right? Okay. All right, this is one kind of grammar, if you like. And I'd like to make the distinction here between the grammar and the grammatics. The grammatics is a way of looking at the grammar, right? So when we look at this here, here's a way of looking at the grammar. This is a particular grammatics, what you might call a traditional grammatics, if you want to name it. And I'm going to show you a very different grammatics as we move through this presentation. Just quickly, a brief history of knowledge about language pedagogy. This is really cutting corners here, so forgive me for the caricaturing that's going on here, but if I have a look at the sort of transition model that I went through school with, you sat down, you kept quiet, and the teacher transmitted the meanings to you, and you just kind of absorbed them in some way. Very teacher-centred, and a lot of meanings given by the teacher. Certainly very little negotiation of meaning going on. And then, at least in Australia in the 1970s, we had a kind of a shift against that, a movement against that kind of teacher-centred pedagogy, and what's been kind of described as progressivist pedagogy, where the student became the pedagogy became far more student-centred. So I've characterised it as student-centred, and the meaning's made by the student, which is kind of slightly exaggerated. And then about the 1990s, we moved into this, what we can call the post-progressivist period. And this is where the work from the Sydney School starts to come in, right? And in a way, that work arose out of the complete failure of the progressivist pedagogy for many of our students. And you can guess what kind of students they were. ESL students, EAL students, working class kids, Indigenous kids, right? So I'm going to try and describe a little bit of that as I go through. What we'll notice with each of these is there's a kind of a knowledge about correct grammar. And as Halliday says, you know, this kind of notion of a rule-based grammar is there to separate the linguistic sheep from the ungrammatical goats. You know, it's a rule-based kind of thing. You're either right or wrong. You get it right, you're here. If you get it wrong, you're down here. In the progressivist model in that 70s and 80s, at least in Australia, there was no study of grammar at all. It just completely, moved out of the landscape. So as we came to the end of the 80s and 1990s, there was this kind of renewed interest, and particularly with the advent of Halliday's and Martin and Rothery's model of language, a renewed interest in what knowledge about grammar, and I think more sort of helpfully, knowledge about language rather than knowledge about grammar, because it kind of puts people off kind of going down to the grammar as if, you know, the G word, you know, that kind of sort of off-putting kind of knowledge angle on that word. And then as we move into the more multi-semiotic approaches, as the meaning-making systems that we're dealing with complexify, we can also start to move into knowledge about the grammar, including the visual grammar, and there's been a lot of interesting work done on that. Okay, here's the model. You know, we usually take about, at least 5 full days to explain this. So I'll just say it's that you've got it in your handout there, and I'll come back to it. Just let me show it to you here. And I'm kind of making the point here that it's much more helpful to talk about a functional model of language rather than the grammar, you know, as if the grammar is kind of one element of it. You know, like strictly speaking in this model, right down here in this kind of layer here, you're talking about the grammar, the lexicogrammar. So it's much more useful to be talking about this model of language. Where did it come from? We've mentioned the Sydney School. Michael Halliday is the principal architect, and no one would dispute that. I've kind of picked out a couple of little points here along the way. In 1954, he was the assistant lecturer in Chinese at Cambridge University. I worked out his age. He was 29 at that point, 29. I don't know what you were doing at 29, but I was sort of playing cricket somewhere, you know. But he was chosen for Chinese because of his capacity to pick up intonation patterns, particularly as one of his strengths. But also this model of language that we're going to kind of show you some of came out of his work in teaching Chinese with students. He said, you know, there's got to be a better kind of grammar around than traditional grammar to teach about language. In 1964, some of you here would remember the Linguistics and English Teaching Project in the UK. The Breakthrough to Literacy came out of that, and the Language in Use, that absolutely fabulous document that still stands after all these years. 1975, he wrote Learning How to Mean, and this was explorations in the development of language and child language in particular. And he tells an interesting story about learning how to mean. He said when he wanted to call it that, the editor said, "You can't say that. No one says that in English. It's a really strange thing to say." And he said, "That's what I want to say, and I'm going to say it," right? And every time it's translated into another language, the editor says the same thing to him. You can't say that. So we'll take up this notion of learning how to mean, and he's very interested in meaning making and the resources that we have at our disposal, principally language, for meaning making. 76 went to the Sydney University, and in 85 wrote his seminal book, An Introduction to Functional Grammar. Okay, just to kind of sort of link that to the grammar a bit, he says, but thought, not all thought perhaps, but certainly all systematic thought is construed in language, and the powerhouse of a language is its grammar. So he always saw, the grammar as having a kind of a particular place in the meaning-making system, and in particular in teaching. It was always a kind of project, a life project of his, to improve educational outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged kids. The other two that I'll mention briefly are Joan Rothery and Jim Martin. Joan Rothery was an English teacher in Sydney, and was doing her PhD, or a master's I think it was at the time, and met Jim Martin, and they did a seminal piece of research in 1983 on the where they looked at a huge number of texts written in schooling, in primary school, and found that the majority of them were narratives, right? And of course, when you get to secondary school, who writes a narrative, right? I've never written a narrative in my life, right? Maybe some people would say, well, bad luck you, but it hasn't, you can see once you got to secondary school, there's a whole set of other texts that you are expected to produce beyond narratives. Okay, so let's take this. How was this taken up in Adelaide? Well, here's me in 1991, and I went to Sydney and I heard Jim Martin talk with Robert Veal for the first time on the language of science. And I'd have to say I used the word electrified. I was electrified by what I heard. I felt for the first time, because previous to that I'd been a teacher of Italian, maths teacher, an ESL teacher. I felt for the first time that we got a glimpse of some kind of way out of this, this helping students to improve, particularly their writing. I can remember immediately after the session, I was sitting next to a colleague from South Australia, and I just turned to her and I said, "Wasn't that amazing?" And she said, "He's a fascist." Because they were proposing a much more direct and authoritative teaching process. Does that make sense? Not authoritarian, of course. She mistook them for both. Okay, so we started to write our first, versions of the language and literacy course. And then we started to write the Teaching ESL Students in Mainstream Classrooms course, which is known as LILAC here, which is the sort of subtitle, Language and Learning Across the Curriculum. And there's various versions of that available now. We then wrote the How Language Works course in about 2010, and I'll be delivering that next week to 5 people here in Norwich. Looking forward to that. And there's a couple of other courses, the Literacy for Learning course, which is a more generalist literacy course, and most recently, Teaching Young Children in English in Multilingual Classrooms. So they're the sort of teacher training books that we use. We train the tutors up, and then the tutors then go off and work with teachers. Now, all of these courses are based on the text in context model. Right, so the text, if we take a text to mean any set of meanings at all, any set of meanings, then those meanings are shaped by the context in which they are being used. Right? We were just exploring in the previous session with Catherine Driver the meaning of mean in mathematics compared to mean outside of mathematics. Right? So the context is always crucial in understanding how we make meaning. Now this translates into the model itself. The context we see has got two layers, a more abstract layer, context of culture, and then a more immediate context, a context of situation. And then, the text, of course, is, if we just take text here to mean a stretch of language, then a text is just an instance. Any given text is just a set of choices from the language system. I like this quote from Halliday. He says this: the important thing about the nature of a text is that although when we write it down it looks as though it's made of words and sentences, it's really made of meanings. So his whole model is kind of oriented to meaning making, and that's been very influential in the work we've been doing. So if we look at the act of meaning making, we can think about it as constructing meanings from text, but also which we can say is comprehending text, but also constructing meanings through text, as I'm doing now, or composing text. So this is our kind of angle on the world, if you like. Literacy can be seen as a capacity to make meaning across a range of contexts. So when we say someone is literate, they have a capacity, they are able to make meaning in this context and in that context. Not necessarily in all contexts. Very few, we can't do that. We are all limited to the kinds of contexts in which we can make meaning. But if we look at literacy as a capacity to make meaning across all contexts, then literacy is a capacity to make meaning across the learning areas. So each of the learning areas that we children work through can be seen as different contexts for making meaning. All right, so we can see it this way. We can think about making meaning in economics, in history, in art, phys ed, so it goes on. So, the kind of schooling project is one of making meaning. The big question becomes, what do we teach about the meaning-making resources? How do we build those meaning-making resources so that the students can operate across and within all of those various contexts? Okay, well, we come back to the model itself, and you can see here that each of these little groupings on the right, these are the sort of things that we can use, we can take up through the model. So at the level of genre, we can look at the purpose of a text, we can look at the stages and phases of the text, how does it unfold. In terms of the register, we can look at the field, the subject matter, what the text is about. We can look at the tenor, the roles and the relationships, the who of the text. And I heard Catherine say this is very problematic for EAL students, and I think it is. It's so nuanced and so delicate at times that it's very difficult to unravel all of that stuff about the role that you take on, the nature of the relationship between the people you're talking to or writing to, and so on. And then the mode, which is the mode of communication, how spoken or written the text is, and the channel of communication. And then we look at the language choices that express the meanings we want to make, right? So it takes up all of those things. Now, with the register, we can apply this to a register continuum here, where we look at moving in terms of the subject matter or the field from everyday and concrete to technical and abstract. In terms of the tenor, in terms of the roles and relationships, from informal, personal and novice to formal and impersonal and informed. And then mode from most spoken, the here and now, language accompanying action, to the most written generalised, where language constitutes the text. So you can see, the Bix and Calp kind of split here, can't you? The Bix is more on this left-hand side and the Calp more over on the right-hand side. The notion of register is taken up in the national curriculum, by the way. And I just found this the other day. And it says, this is what it says in that little glossary that you've got back there. It says, classroom lessons, football commentaries and novels use different registers of the same language. Are they the only things that use different registers? They're just examples, aren't they? They're 3 out of the trillions of registers almost that you could come up with. Registers are varieties of a language which are each tied to a range of uses, in contrast with dialects which are tied to groups of users. So that's nice. Okay. It does better than the Australian curriculum. It's never mentioned in the Australian curriculum. All right, now the explicit teaching and learning cycle. Once again, this takes a bit of work to kind of explicate, but if you go to page 4 on your handout, you've got at least a diagram of it there. And in the centre, it says the focus, understanding or capability being developed in this cycle. And this could be anything from, tying your shoelaces to understanding the water cycle, something very simple where you have a quick cycle to something much more complex. And it can vary in time and in scope. Okay, so we have 4 stages here. We have setting the context, where the teachers are preparing the students with all sorts of activities that engage the students. We have modelling and deconstruction of the kind of text that the kids have to produce at the end. The joint construction, where the teachers and students are jointly constructing the meanings. And this is a really crucial stage, and one we've got to do a lot of work on. We have a lot of, this is probably the least well done stage of this cycle, I would say. And then the students, in going through those stages, are ready for independent construction. So that's a kind of a brief kind of summary of that. And as the students move through that, they should be, at the end, ready to do what it is they have to do, whether that's a spoken text or a written text or making a PowerPoint or making a little video, whatever it is. Okay. And we can see 3 broad levels of scaffolding here. I've got these kind of summarised for you there on page 4. So the macro scaffolding is the planned and carefully sequenced tasks in a unit of work designed to develop the knowledge, skills and language required to achieve the goal, right? So this is a kind of planning out our unit of work. There's one missing here that's just been, John and I have just introduced, and John thought he was being very original coming up with meso scaffolding, but Theo van Leer, is it Theo van Leer or Van Leer? I'm not sure what his first name is. Theo van Leer? Theo? Yeah. He's used meso scaffolding, the term, but in a different way that we're using it here. We're using it here to mean the structuring of activities within each lesson. So what do you do first? What do you do next? And you in England would be very familiar with the kind of lessons, where you're very rigidly told how to run the lesson, weren't you? With the plenary, and then you do this, or the starter and then the plenary and so on. Thankfully that's disappeared, I think, hasn't it? Yeah. And then the micro scaffolding is a different kind of scaffolding. This is the kind of scaffolding that goes on, the interactions between the teacher and the student. So this is a different order of scaffolding than macro and meso. Okay, here's a big question. And this comes from an article that Jim Martin wrote, and he actually said this. He said, is meta-language in fact scaffolding that hangs around? This is a very interesting question. If we build our students' capacity to understand language, will it help? Will it stick around? Right? And that's been a kind of a very interesting question for me. Okay, let's have a look. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to, or go on to part B now and look at what's happening in the classroom. Okay, and you can make your own mind up at the end about that. Is meta-language scaffolding that hangs around? Okay, so we're going to start with the clause, and I'm going to draw on some work here from what's called the Pines Intensive Language Centre. The intensive language centres back home are classrooms within schools. You can't find an intensive language centre really. They're in a school. They're in an ordinary old school. There might be one classroom or two classrooms. They do the same curriculum as everybody else, but the new arrivals go in there and get intensive language instruction. And they are the best institutions in the country, in my view. And Priyanka Sharma, her work, you're going to see some of her students, some of the work she's done around the clause and also around this thing called the nominal group or the noun group. All right. I don't want to scare you with this, but this is the clause, and this is what Halliday calls a globule of meaning, with a central kind of going on in the middle, the process, which is realised as a verb. So verb, process are sort of, we're talking the same thing. And engaged in that process are these participants. Someone's doing the action. Sometimes the action goes on to something else. So we call those the participants. And these are typically noun groups that do this. And then the circumstances are the kind of, the kind of environment in which these central actions take place. Okay. The colour coding, incidentally, comes from one of the best teachers I've ever seen, Ruth French. When she was a first-year out teacher, she did a project with Jeff Williams and Joan Rothery in Sydney for a year when she taught her students these, among other things, these groupings, participants, process and circumstances. And she used the colour coding red, green and blue. She just chose it. There was completely random choice, but we took up that colour coding in all our courses now, and in fact, anybody that's doing systemics in Australia in classrooms invariably uses this colour coding. Green, traffic light means what? Go, action, right? Red, stop, right? Blue is the sky, the environment for these things to happen. So, our new national curriculum, we've got a national curriculum in Australia for the first time for about the last 4 or 5 years. This is from the English national curriculum, and you can see right in the centre of there it says making meaning. This really gladdened my heart when I saw this. It even gladdened my heart even more when we saw the 3 strands of the national curriculum: language, literature and literacy. The literature strand is very kind of what you'd expect in a typical English literature kind of scope and sequence, right? There's nothing surprising there. The literacy strand is a dog's breakfast, so we won't talk about that. But the language strand is very interesting because if we have a look, for instance, at the 3 sub-strands, language for interaction, text structure and organisation, expressing and developing ideas, then what you'll see is that just fits beautifully into the functional model. And it's not surprising because the language strand was principally written by a systemicist, Bev Derivienko, who some of you may have heard of. Okay, so it's a functional model that's underpinning our national curriculum. Okay. All right, let's get down to the language system now. Now, you've got this text on page 5, so all right, so I'm going to go through this quickly. I can feel myself rushing already, but so just bear with me here. But we're going to focus on the language, on the method section here, where we've got a set of commands: sift, mix, add, and so on. And if I look at, go back to our Australian curriculum, you can't read that, but it says identify the parts. This is level 1. This is kids that are 6 years old. This is what they're expected to know and understand. They have to identify the parts of a simple sentence that represent what's happening, who or what is involved, and the surrounding circumstances. Can you smell a systemicist in here? Yeah? This is a sheep in wolf's clothing, right? A wolf in sheep's clothing, I should say. Yeah? So it's kind of, as you go through and have a look at that at year 3 level, it says understand that a clause is a unit of grammar, usually containing a subject and a verb, and these need to be in agreement, and knowing that a clause is basically a group of words that contain a verb. And once again, it repeats about what is happening, who or what is involved, is participating. Can you see the participating? Yeah, and the surrounding circumstances. Okay. All right, so if I go to the method section now, and if you've got your red, green and blue pens ready, you can colour code this. And I can, if I was introducing this to the students for the first time, I wouldn't be walking in and doing a grammar lesson. I'd be making these damn things, these Thai pancakes. It would be part of the whole kind of lesson, right? Would be part of the activity of teaching about recipes, yeah? Okay, but what we're going to do is we're going to dive in. We're going to do what we shouldn't do. We're going to dive into the grammar. Okay, so if I ask certain questions around this, if I said in the first sentence there, sift the flour and baking powder together into a bowl, and if I said, what should I do to the flour and baking powder, the answer would be sift. Okay, so I'm going to colour code that green because that's the action. If I now ask the question, sift what together into a bowl, the answer would be the flour and baking powder. If I said, how should I do it, I'd get the word together. And if I said, where should it happen, it would be into a bowl, I'd get the blue. So you can see that we get this pattern of colour coding. And if I just go through this quickly, you can see that there's a pattern emerging there, isn't there? Yeah? The green's at the front, the verb's at the front, the processes up the front, except in number 3, where we've got a blue, a circumstance that's there. And we could explore the reason why slowly has been pushed up the front of that clause. Yeah? Ask Jamie Oliver. All right. Here's, I've just got to find my little cursor here. It's just bear with me. Okay. This is in Priyanka's class. This is just a little clip of this, some of the work they do around this colour coding.
What?
So what happened?
What?
Yes, who watched?
Yeah.
Cynthia watched.
A movie.
Cynthia watched a movie, yes.
Uh,
Where?
in her home
In her home. And when?
on Friday.
On Friday. Well done, James.
And can I do a read?
Oh, you want to do one more? Okay. Okay, you want to do yours? Yeah.
What?
What happened?
Went.
Yes, who went?
Jay.
James went. James went where?
To church
To church
with his family.
with his family. Well done. Look at you. One more? Okay.
Okay, we'll stop it there. She can't stop him, by the way. He just goes on. And the other kids all want to get in on it, you know. And it's beautiful. I just find this very interesting because the kids love it, right? And I have never seen in 20 years of teachers teaching the grammar well where the kids don't love it. How about that? Yeah? Okay. And in fact, with Ruth French's class, she was teaching this class at, what was the school? Haberfield Primary in Sydney. At the end of the year, 15 of the students who were going off into high school came up to Ruth and Jeff and said, can we go on with this grammar work? And they formed the Haberfield Grammar Club. And every Wednesday night for an hour and a half, they met and looked at grammar and language in context. That's how much kids hate it, you see. They really hate it. Okay, let me tell you about Rosa Valente very quickly. She's the teacher of Jackson. And she was looking at recounts, and her focus genre is a recount in Italian. And when I taught Italian, you couldn't do recounts until year 10. You know why? Because you couldn't, to do a recount, you need what tense? The past tense. And you did the past tense in year 10, didn't you? You did the present tense in year 8, the future tense in year 9. It's just such stupidity. And we said to, one of the things we talked about with Rosa was, let's just teach them recounts, right? So Rosa being the bold and the brave, she did. So she modelled the text, and of course a very simple text where there's an orientamento, there's an orientation, sequenza di eventi, a sequence of events, and then a commento personale. So she set up the model text, took them through, deconstructed it a bit, gave them this grammar, right? Because these kids knew about functional grammar. They knew the colour coding, and they'd done a little bit before in previous years. These were students that had one lesson a week in Italian. And this year, in the year that the students produced this text, it doubled because the principal found that the work she was doing, Rosa suddenly had other teachers coming into a classroom and saying, "What are you doing? Why are the kids so happy in your class?" Yeah? Okay, so she did a lot of this kind of teaching them the various parts of the grammar here. And you can see this, we've grammarified it, we've turned the participant, the processo, partecipante, circostanza, right? And that was on Michael Halliday's advice, by the way. I went up to him at one of the conferences in Sydney and told him we were going to do this Italian work. And I said, "What about the functional grammar in Italian?" And he said, "No one's written one." I said, "What do we do about the groupings?" He said, "Make them up." So we did. And there we are. Beautiful. And it just happens to fit, mostly. Okay. So you can see there's the text. There's Jackson's text here. A lovely little text. Here's another one from one of the students, Cecilia. This is my holiday. In my holidays sono andata a Queensland. I went to Queensland per 2 settimane, for 2 weeks. Sono andato con la mia famiglia. I went with my family. I went to SeaWorld. Ho visto le foche. She's made a spelling mistake there, which is just horrendous. That's a joke. Nella seconda settimana, lunedì, sono andato a Underworld. In the second week, on Monday, I went there. I saw a Stella de Mare. I saw my friends. And then Wednesday I went to Bindi Zoo, you know Bindi Irwin, some of you would know her. Okay, ho visto Bindi. Okay, the next thing we did was shift it around from telling to asking someone about their holidays. It's one thing to do a simple recount like that. It's another level of difficulty to go up to someone and say, "What did you do during your holidays?" Yeah? Just think of the grammar, the grammatical shifts there. Anyway, they explored them with the students. And, you know, if you know Italian, then you don't need that participant there, can just be ellipsed out. So, dove sei andato per le tue vacanze? Where did you go for your holidays and so on? Okay. Here's some of the text from some of the kids. And, you know, the kids were just given, just write a dialogue. So this is a dialogue between frozen pizza and frozen butter and peanut butter. And it says basically, "Hello, my name's Frozen Pizza. Hello, my name's Peanut Butter. Where did you go for your holiday?" "Sono andato a Woolworths." "I went to Woolworths." "Per quanto tempo sei andato?" "For how long did you go?" "I went there for 4 days." "Con chi sei andato?" "With whom did you go?" "I went with Vegemite and toast." Yeah, so the kids are having great fun. Okay, here's a little text here from a couple of the kids. Okay, fantastic. And if you've learned a second language, you know how difficult that is to do, don't you? Yeah? I mean, I think about I'm putting some effort into learning Polish at the moment, and I'm so far away from that I can't begin to think about it. Okay, let's move to the second one, moving from spoken to written language now. And this is kind of raises this whole issue from talking about it to writing about it as very different kinds of spaces, very different meaning-making spaces, and one that some children never kind of move to. and similarly from reading about it to talking about it. So we can think about these shifts across the register continuum as a kind of semiotic wall, a meaning-making wall that the kids have to kind of work through, right? And some kids just never get there. They never see the other side of this wall. They never penetrate it, all right? And it's picked up in the Australian curriculum about the differences between spoken and written-like language. It's picked up in your national curriculum here, vocabulary and structures that are appropriate for formal speech and writing, including subjunctive forms, using expanded noun phrases to convey complicated information concisely, knowing and understanding the difference between spoken and written language, including differences associated with formal and informal registers. Okay, so this is a biggie. This is a biggie. All right, if we look at the differences here, we can see this text here on the left. Environmental damage can be caused by personal actions, because if everybody throws litter, waste, electricity and all the other things, then our planet would be destroyed soon, because if we do our bit to help out, then it would help. But if everyone did help, and it just goes on and on and on. The student knows something about the topic, don't they? Yeah. But they're writing as if they're writing in spoken mode. What we want, what the teacher would want in that, is something on the other side, something further to the right, not necessarily as far to the right as this text. But if we look at those two texts, then we get very different grammars, right? In the text on the left, we get 10 clauses in one sentence. In the text on the right, we get one clause in one sentence and two clauses in one sentence, yeah? So we get a very different kind of grammatical makeup here of this text. So this one's got a lot of intricacy. This one's got a lot of, well, some degree of simplicity in some sense. If I look at the noun groups, and I've just sort of identified these here in red, and where there's more than one word, I've kind of put a bracket around them, then you can see just looking at it that the noun groups, that is the words, the information built up around each noun, on the left is very short. Agreed? They're very short. If we look at the right, we get a very different picture there. Okay, so come back to Priyanka now and teaching her students with a focus on noun groups in narrative writing. And I'm just going to kind of whiz through this, but I just wanted to show this because she didn't just walk in and teach them about noun groups. This was part of a whole unit of work on teaching narratives, right? From the purpose of writing narratives, and then how she introduced noun groups, the kind of work she did to build up the words, the vocab, if you like, these kind of word walls and so on were part of it. I'm just picking out bits of it, by the way. And then she introduced classifiers here. Yeah? Now, if we take the feature that the text on the left, the more spoken text, has got simple noun groups, and the text on the right has got more complex nominal groups, let's have a look at one of her students talking about this. Now, remember, this is a new arrival student. She's getting near the end of her stay in the new arrival centre. So she's been in the new arrival 12 months. And you can hear, interestingly, I think she's got the same accent as the teacher, which is not surprising, is it? Yeah? Okay.
Not long ago, there was a man. He was very old. He came from Bulgaria. He lived in a small cottage. He lived with his dog. I've kept all the information in one sentence using noun groups.
So what's the thing, Rita?
Man.
Yes, so man is the noun. And what's the pointer?
A.
And what's the job of a pointer?
It points everything.
Yes. And what describers you've chosen to describe the man?
Old.
So only one describer?
Yes.
Yes. And what's the intensifier?
Very.
And what is the job of an intensifier?
It makes the describer more powerful.
Oh, fantastic. What about classifier?
The classifier tells us what kind.
And you've used?
Bulgarian.
Okay. And what qualifier you've used?
Who lives in a small cottage with his dog.
So you've used two qualifiers here. Okay, is it a sentence?
No.
So what do you need to do to make it a sentence?
Add a process.
So yes, so what process you added?
Found.
Yes, and found what?
Found an expensive diamond ring.
Beautiful. Can you tell me what happened?
Found.
Yes, what? Who found?
A very old Bulgarian man who lives in a small cottage with his dog
Found what?
an expensive diamond ring.
Can you see there is a noun group here as well? Another noun group?
N is the pointer.
Well done.
Expensive is the describer.
Yes,
Diamond is the classifier.
yes.
Ring is the thing.
Well done. Fantastic, Rita.
Yeah, you know, this student here is going to find it so much easier to move to written mode than students that haven't had that work, right? I think this is just very inspiring work from my perspective to see, and you can see the student wanting to take over. It's not the teacher's sort of leading the student here, but you can see at the end, she's got the red pencil for the participant before the teacher can even say anything. So, okay, I'm looking at my clock. How am I doing for time, Mark? 10 minutes? Okay. I'm gonna skip the next section, so just bear with me as I go through here. This is about nominalisation. This is, if we just maybe look at this first one here. This is another kind of resource for moving across the register continuum. So she was intelligent, charming and very witty, and this impressed everyone. If we look at the adjective, if you like, intelligent, and change it to intelligence, we've changed it from an adjective into a noun, right? So this process is called nominalisation. Charming, we can change to charm, yeah? She was charming into charm. And witty, she was very witty, we can change to wit. And then we can reconstruct a sentence or come up with a different version of a sentence. So everybody was impressed by her charm, wit and intelligence, right? And this is, of course, the one on the left is more spoken. It's not very, very spoken, but it's more spoken. The one on the right is more written. And every student that's ever been shown how to do that has shown an improvement in their writing. I've got thousands of nominalisation stories. Talk to me afterwards. Okay, we've got to move on because I'm running out of time. Here's Helen Hanford up in Parkview with a group of students. Here's some examples of what she did. You can see the little green bits here that have been nominalised into the red bits. So to give in to a lot of Germany's demands, so that becomes appeasement. Invaded Austria, Hitler invaded, so the invasion of Austria, and France agreed becomes the agreement. So this is absolutely crucial in all those subjects like history and English and in art. Here's a typical art response from a student in Year 12, very high achieving art response. And if I look at the nominalisations in red, there they are. You can just see them. And if you can't nominalise like this, if you can't construe this kind of language, you simply aren't going to achieve a high mark. And here's another example from English. And I just sort of glaze your eyes as you watch this rather than try and read it, but you can see all the red bits popping up, right? Okay. The unit of work on light. Okay. I'm gonna just speed through this. This is cruel. Okay. This is a school that's done a lot of work on language teaching. They were looking at a causal explanation on how a periscope works. They started off with all these wonderful activities around light activities. They were explaining how we could see things. They were looking at transparency. They were looking at exploring shadows and so on. They started off with light as a form of electromagnetic radiation. These were 10-year-olds, right? The work that was set out in their curriculum documents was so pathetic that we said, let's give these kids something really meaningful here. Let's let them understand about light rather than just do a whole lot of little shadow activities and play around in the thing. And goodness, they did some wonderful work. And I'm going to speed through this, so bear with me. But they did some reading, close reading here. What does the we mean? What does the we refer to in this sentence? Sources. What are sources? Primary sources, secondary sources. Anyway, you get the drift. A lot of close reading activities, a lot of deconstruction of the text. And what I want to get to eventually is I did some work on changing the active voice into passive voice, right? I fixed the measurement screen to a darkened wall, bringing the measurement screen up the front, putting the fix there, fixed I. That doesn't work. To a darkened wall, you can change that. You have to change the verb, was fixed. You can change that to by me, or you can get rid of the by me, right? So you got the passive voice. So they did this work, right, with the students. Okay, here are the kids doing their work, making their periscopes, and they had to explain how these periscopes worked. All right, here's one of the best ones. Light is produced and emitted from the primary source of light, the light bulb. Some of this light travels to the secondary source, the objects, and once that portion of the light reaches the object, it reflects off it and travels to the first mirror of the periscope. When some of the light gets to the first mirror, it reflects directly onto the second mirror, where it gets reflected once more, this time out of the periscope and into our eyes, and so it goes on. This is an absolutely fantastic text from an 11-year-old student, isn't it? Yeah, it's brilliant. This is an ESL student, and she missed half of the teaching and learning cycle here. And you can see that even she went back to India during the thing, and even she made some progress here. You can see she's picked up on some of the technical language here. She's picked up on the passive voice and so on. Okay. The teacher herself says, I was dreading teaching this unit. We left it last in the too hard basket. Right? And at the end, she couldn't stop. She just loved it. The kids loved it. They didn't want to stop. It was 2 days before the Christmas holidays. They were still going on this unit of work. And the kids didn't want to stop, and the teacher didn't want to stop. Okay, there's one context of success. How am I going? I'm doing well. Okay, I'm going to do this really quickly. Here's Helen that we saw before with her class here. Let's just focus on, they track their progress over 2 years. Years 7 and 8, this particular group of kids. These all were some of the weakest kids in the school, and she was teaching them history. And let's best focus on this last 2 paragraphs here. In the term where Helen was supporting Phil was one of the teachers, the class made 5.4 points progress, almost a whole level. Thanks to this accelerated progress in term 2, by Easter the class made an average of 8.2 points progress in year 8, 1 whole level and a sub-level in 2 terms. So in other words, they got through a whole year in half the time with this work, right? Okay. If you're into Hattie F's effect size of 0.88. All right. I could tell you about the work of Graham Smith, who's here today from when he was working in heading Cambridge Education in Islington, and show you the data of improvement for the ESL students or EAL students in Islington, right? And you can see that brown kind of graph there at the bottom, and how it goes against the trend of all of the other graphs there, other lines, yeah? And to achieve that in 3 years, I think is remarkable, right? And they did it through the work, through the courses, through the Lilac course, through their own interventions and so on. There's the same kind of thing, the attainment at GCSE here, and you can see the same pattern emerging. Michelle Stanley, who's here today, still working at Enfield, and has just had a serious evaluation done on the work they're doing through Lilac. Here's the conclusion. The program has an unambiguously positive impact, and our study makes the case that the program should be scaled up given its success. I won't show you Neil McGorran talking. He was from a school in Adelaide, Nazareth College. Nazareth College, by year 10, had eliminated this. The students did not write any text below sea level in this school. And this is a working class school in Adelaide. And in the year that I did this interview with him, they got their first 20 out of 20 at their last year of schooling for the first time ever. And it was the phys ed teacher in the school. Yeah? So, okay, to finish off, Educational failure is largely linguistic failure. That's a very strong view coming from Michael Halliday. It's one that I share, and one that I think we can make a huge impact on as we build up our students' capacity to make meaning through looking at the language system. Joan Rothery, who made such a valuable contribution, she said this in 1996. I think things have changed a little since then, but the message is clear for educators. If we want our students to develop high levels of literacy and a critical orientation, we must engage them at all levels in an explicit focus on language. Not just language, but explicitness about how language works to mean is at the heart of educational linguistics. Right? And, okay. So, summary, continue to build on the vision where we recognise the affordances set up by taking a critical metalinguistic capacity, by building a critical metalinguistic capacity in both teachers and students. We can only do this work with our students if we have that capacity ourselves, and that's, you know, in a way, that's my life's work, has been doing that in the last 15 years at least, building teachers' capacity, metalinguistic capacity, so that they can in turn do that with their students. Keep the aspirations high for both teachers and students so that we can realise some of the potential we've seen a glimpse of here. You know, when we first started this work, the people from the New Arrivals Centre said, keep away from us. Don't bring that work near us. These are new arrival kids. You can't do this kind of grammar work with these kids. The most intensive people, the people who do the most intensive work around functional grammar now are, guess where? The new arrival centres. Yes, you're right, yes. And we saw some of that work there today with those two little videos. So imagine what kinds of dispositions we would build in students over 12 years of schooling. 12 years to do this work if we unfold a rich and considered pedagogy which has at its heart explicitness about how we mean. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.